Okay, so welcome again to today's webinar, Correctly Disclosing Conflicts of Interest. My name is Joe Munch. I'm a senior scientific editor in scientific publications in the Research Medical Library, and with me today is
Ryan Ingraham. I'm a legal officer in institutional compliance here at MD Anderson, and I'm over the Conflicts of Interest program.
so we're just going to kind of go through a series of questions and talk about conflicts of interest. Feel free to interject and ask anything you'd like related to the topic and within reason, of course. But of course, let's just start with what is a conflict of interest?
So, at its most basic level, a conflict of interest is a outside interest, so external to MD Anderson, especially because we're a state institution, and so we've got a whole separate set of rights and responsibilities to fall under that. So something outside of MD Anderson, typically something where you're receiving some kind of financial compensation, so a consulting fee or equity, so like a stock options, that kind of thing. And that is what we call a financial interest. And then when that financial interest relates to your institutional responsibilities, so it's related to research, it's related to clinical care, even like in our case where, not clinicians, not researchers, if I were to advise my boss that we should go with a certain law firm and they also were paying me on the side for some legal consulting, which, to be clear, no one is. But if I were to do that, that'd be a conflict of interest because I have a financial relationship with that entity external to MD Anderson, and it is, or at least could appear to have an influence on my institutional responsibilities.
Right. So can a conflict of interest, must it be financial, or is there a different kind of level of
So
conflict of interest?
by and large, most of the things we see that are conflicts of interest are going to have some kind of financial component, even to the level of under federal regulations. If you're an investigator, you're required to disclose any sponsored travel you receive from a private entity. So, you go to a conference and they pay for your travel because you're going to be presenting. That requires disclosure under the federal regulations. It's considered a financial interest that requires COI disclosure. But there are also some things, and we kind of corner them into conflicts of commitment. So they're maybe unpaid, but they're things that take away from your time at MD Anderson and in one way or another relate to those institutional responsibilities. And so in the realm of disclosing in publications, sometimes those will require disclosure of publication, especially if they're going to be really closely related to your research. Sometimes they won't, but either way, they're going to require disclosure to MD Anderson under our own COI policies. And once they've disclosed to us, we can help advise you on, yep, nope, that needs to be disclosed in a publication, or, you know what, looking at the rules of that specific publication, we're not really worried about it.
Gotcha. So when we talk about the financial interest, does every, and you kind of just talked about this, but does every single financial interest constitute a conflict of interest?
No, not by any means. And in fact, I would say the vast majority of financial interests aren't going to be conflicts. The majority of conflicts we see at MD Anderson are going to be those directly related to research. So you're hired as a consultant by Pfizer, and you also have sponsored research with Pfizer, so a clinical trial, something like that. That's going to be a conflict of interest because you've got the external financial interest on one hand, and you've got the institutional research at MD Anderson on the other. And so we'll implement what we call a conflict of interest management plan to manage that conflict. And a lot of it is around transparency, making sure that our colleagues, our patients, the general public is aware of those financial interests and the bearing it may have on the research.
Okay. And again, you've kind of talked about this a little bit already, but is there, like, what are the specific criteria? When does a financial interest become a conflict of interest? What's kind of the cutoff point?
So the trigger point is going to be when it relates to a specific institutional responsibility. So you have sponsored research related to the entity. You're going to be making business decisions related to the entity. So we're setting up a big strategic alliance with a company. if you have a financial interest with that company, you really shouldn't be the one negotiating on behalf of MD Anderson, because it could create the appearance that you're going to be biased towards the company, or worse, you definitely don't want to be negotiating on behalf of the company against MD Anderson, because as state employees, our primary responsibility is to the institution.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so even the perception of not being impartial can be problematic. That's one of the reasons why we need to have that disclosure, right?
Exactly. And I mean, very, very rarely do we encounter any kind of ill intent when it comes to conflicts of interest. Like, I can only think of a handful of occasions in my career where it's been someone was actually fabricating evidence in their research study because of some external financial interest they have. And to be honest, I don't know that I can actually think of any in my personal experience. It's very, very rare. It's all about managing appearances and doing our best to be transparent, especially because we're state employees. We need to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars.
Right, and it aligns with our core value of integrity.
Exactly.
It's difficult to make the case that you're being impartial if you don't disclose a conflict of interest and then it comes out later. In some ways, that looks even worse.
Right.
So you have a handout that you can download. It looks like this, budding color. So you can go ahead and download that handout, and you'll find some links to some of the policies, but they are long, and they can be kind of dense. So can you give us kind of a nutshell picture of what are MD Anderson's policies in terms of conflict of interest?
So we actually have two separate COI policies. One is specifically for faculty, investigators, researchers, trainees, kind of stemming from the whole research is going to be the most common form of conflict that we interact with. And so that's really the COI policy that we're talking about today, because we're talking about COI and publications. And so that policy, I mean, what it really amounts to is almost any outside relationship you have, go ahead and disclose it just to be safe. I mean, we may come back and say, no, you don't need to disclose that. It falls under an exemption. But due to the really heavy scrutiny in the COI space right now, we've really just been encouraging, err on the side of caution, disclose it, and we'll guide you through the process and help you out. And real quick, the other policy we have applies to non-researchers. So me as a non-faculty, non-researcher, it's actually comes from a UT system policy. And under that one, you only have to disclose if you actively have a outside activity that you're engaging in. So going back to my, some law firm was paying me on the side for legal consulting, I'd have to disclose that. It's a separate system, separate policy from our research one, but it's something to keep in mind for those of us that aren't researchers, don't have faculty appointments. There are still COI responsibilities that we have to satisfy under UT system and Board of Regents policies.
And so saying that you should disclose all potential conflicts, that can be a bit problematic. And I'm thinking of where is that line necessarily drawn? If you have a spouse that has a financial interest, you need to disclose that. If you have family, if you have some other, I guess, indirect relationship with a company or stocks or whatever, is that something you need to disclose?
So when we're talking specifically about our own institutional policy, because when we're talking about disclosing to journals, they have their own rules and it may be slightly different, but just internal to MD Anderson disclosures, if your spouse or dependent children or any other family member that basically has shared financial responsibilities with you, so your brother-in-law lives with you and you share a bank account or something. I don't know. That's a bad example. That's probably not going to happen. But generally speaking, those kind of situations, more often than not, we're talking about, say, a spouse who is an employee at a pharmaceutical company. That's going to require disclosure because it's directly related to your institutional responsibilities. On the other hand, my wife's an attorney. She's a prosecutor. That's not really relevant to MD Anderson, so it wouldn't require disclosure under our policy. When we're talking about family members, it's only going to be if it's falls within the sphere of medical, biological, that kind of stuff, and especially if it's a pharmaceutical or device manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. because I've rarely seen those kinds of disclosures, but I think they might be more common than we realize because there are so many. Well, you just kind of point out you're a lawyer, your wife's a lawyer.
Hmm.
There's professionals tend to marry professionals, and I think there are a lot of medical professionals out there who might not be working for the same institution, but nevertheless are drawing money from potentially conflicting sources. So,
Well, and that's a really good point, especially because Texas is a community property state. And so income is attributed to the family as a whole. So technically, under state law, half of your spouse's income is attributed to you. And so, from a conflict of interest standpoint, that means that if they're drawing a salary from, say, Pfizer, half of that money is attributed to you and would be considered a conflict under state law, even aside from our own institutional policies.
no, and this is why if you are unsure about whether you have a conflict of interest, you need to talk to people like Ryan who know the legalese and the rules of the state, because I had no idea that's, I'm by no stretch a lawyer, and I believe many of our faculty, very few have JDs on top of their MDs or PhDs. So use this resource of the compliance office to check out and make sure that you're kind of above board and transparent and everything.
Yeah, we're always happy to chat. Any questions that anyone ever has. There's no such thing as a stupid question.
I'm gonna try to meet you on that, but so you talked a little bit about why these disclosures are important, and it speaks to the integrity of your research, and it speaks to transparency, and of course there's this possibility that if you have a conflict and don't disclose it, it can reflect very poorly on you, much more so, in fact, than if you had disclosed conflict of interest, right?
Right.
But what are some of the, and you don't have to get into MD Anderson specifics, but what are some of the potential kind of consequences other than that kind of darkened perception that can happen if a person does not say, oh, I have this holding in this company or what have you?
So, I mean, there are real consequences to this. We don't make folks jump through all of these hoops just to justify my salary. I'm not worth that much. I mean, we see examples all the time. Fortunately, not really with MD Anderson, but say for example, you're an investigator on a clinical trial. You have a financial relationship with the sponsor that's not disclosed to the institution, isn't disclosed to patients. Worst case scenario, I mean, a lot of our patients are very sick. Some of them die for reasons completely unrelated to maybe the clinical trial that they're on, but the family member is going to be distraught. They're going to want answers. And if it comes out that, there was this undisclosed financial relationship of the PI on the study, that's not going to reflect well on the PI, on the institution. I mean, there have even been lawsuits related to this, and I'm not going to go too deep into the legal side of it, but I mean, there are consequences. And so that's why it's so very important to disclose, be transparent, and not only disclose to MD Anderson under our COI policies, but also to be sure to disclose in publications, because that's what we're here talking about today. There are some very stark examples, even as recently as about a year ago, of individuals at other institutions who they were disclosing everything to the institution under the policy appropriately. They weren't disclosing that in their publications. And there were a series of journalists who started digging into that, found the inconsistencies, and this one person ended up resigning and losing their job because, they were disclosing to the institution, but not in their publications. And so all of that just to drive home that there are consequences to this. And if you have questions, please, please, please reach out. We're here to help. We want to help you do the right thing.
Yeah, definitely. And so let's talk a little bit about disclosing to publications. So for those of you out there who have published, you have probably in a peer-reviewed, reputable journal, you've probably had to have a statement of a disclosure of conflict of interest, or you've actually had to fill out a form. For the time being, it's kind of varies from journal to journal. Some have very specific requirements. Some say you have to just disclose everything. Some say you have to disclose just relevant information, and that's really kind of the murky areas. What is this relevant information?
Right.
And I don't know if you have a good answer for this, but go ahead and
So
shoot.
the problem with this area, and I'll preface it with no, I don't have a good answer for it, and I know that's really not helpful. The problem is, as you alluded to, all of the, or not all of, but a lot of journals have different requirements, and a lot of them relate to what's relevant. And so I can help you interpret what the rule is asking for, but I don't have a science background. You really don't want me trying to advise you on what's relevant to a research study. And so, because of that, it puts us in this weird space where the person that's best situated to answer the question of, is this financial relationship relevant to the article, is the individual who owns that financial relationship. And so, by that very nature, you're inherently conflicted on it. So, what we have been advising is when in doubt, just disclose anything you may think may be related, or going to an even further extreme, just disclose everything. I mean, you can go into our COI database and see all of the disclosures that you've made to us. And if you have any questions about interpreting what's in there, shoot us an email, give us a call. We'll have happy to help you out with it. And then just disclose all of it. Because then the onus is no longer on you. You've made all of your disclosures to publication. If they don't want all of them, then they can make the determinations and leave them out. I will say that this is an issue that a lot of people recognize, and on a national level, a number of institutions and journals are working together to try and come up with a good solution to unify the requirements, hopefully even unify a standard publication disclosure form. So regardless of which publication you're going to be publishing in or submitting something to publication, you just list all of your conflicts of interest, send it out to them, and that's the end of it.
And that would be a phenomenal tool
Yeah,
for
it
any
would.
researcher who's had to submit to multiple journals and reformulate their conflict of interest statement with every submission. It would be
Right.
so much easier to just have something universal.
So hopefully a lot more to come on that soon, but we're kind of in the early stages of figuring out what that should look like. But we're going to do our best to come up with a solution because it is a problem that needs a solution. The way we've been doing it for years just frankly is no longer sufficient in the current climate that we're in.
I think that's a very true statement. Across the board, it's with information being so available to people and everything having kind of a immediacy to it, you really need something one and done, so to speak.
Right.
So we're going to keep our ears to the ground about that, and when something comes to fruition, we're gonna tell you. We have a question in our chat box here. Let's see if I can strain my eyes. So if a researcher has funding from or has consulted with pharmaceutical companies A, B, and C and is publishing a manuscript about a drug from company D, so a different company,
Right.
that involves a different molecular pathway and different subgroup of patients, the relationships with A, B, and C should be disclosed. Is that correct?
So this falls directly into what we were just talking about, whether or not it's relevant, and also whether or not the specific journal that you're submitting it to publication would has a rule that says only disclose what's relevant. So if you're only if that specific journal is only requiring you to disclose things that are relevant, A, B, and C in that case wouldn't necessarily be relevant. Under the current climate, I would still probably advise you to disclose everything just to be safe. But it's one of those things that on a case by case basis, we can look at it, we can have a conversation about it, and try and help you determine what the best route's going to be. And again, I apologize because I know that's not a really great answer, and that's why we're trying to work towards this universal disclosure form for everything, because trying to look at whether or not something's relevant is very, very subjective, and different people are going to come to different conclusions.
Well, and thinking about this example of companies A, B, C, and D, with companies merging so often and being bought out, and you don't know if, company A might be a subsidiary of company B, company B and D might have some partnership. So I have the feeling that even if you have some some financial interest in one of these companies, you might not know ultimately where that financial interest sits,
I
right?
mean, honestly, it's almost comical. My office keeps a running list of the various relationships, subsidiaries, partnerships between all of the drug companies because as we're going through reviewing disclosures, if we note something, we'll add it to the spreadsheet or we'll do a Google search and see, if there's a news article talking about a merger, buyout, whatever. But even that is only as complete as what we look at. There's no single source of truth as to what's related and what's not. So it is a very complicated landscape.
And it changes
Yeah, on a
almost
daily
constantly,
basis.
right? Okay, so let's see. Yeah, you're obviously we've talked about some of the resources from the compliance office. You yourself are a resource of sorts. But are there any other resources available at MD Anderson that people can turn to when they need help with conflict of interest?
So we do have our internal COI website. So if you go, honestly, the easiest way to get to it is on the inside MD Anderson search box. Just search for COI or conflict of interest, and it'll be the first thing to pop up. And we've got a series of pages with guidance on circumstances of what requires disclosure, what doesn't, what management plans look like, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I can't reiterate enough. If you have questions, please reach out to my office because a lot of this is evaluated on a case by case basis. And so I'd hate for someone to make an assumption based on kind of the general guidance we have online, and there's just one weird kernel of their relationship that would require disclosure when it otherwise wouldn't. And so if you have questions, ask, and we want to be here to help.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's a phone number on this this handout that you can download. 713-745-6636. Is that correct?
Right.
So if you're in a talky mood, you can go ahead and call up compliance and get some answers. I think those are all the questions we have. Unless anybody has any more, please feel free to put them in the chat box. In the meantime, we might have one here. But in the meantime, is there anything that we haven't really gone over that we should, in your mind?
I don't think so. We've done a pretty good job of covering the high points. I mean, honestly, I really like the sound of my own voice. I could sit here and talk about COI all day, but nobody wants that. So
hopefully one webinar will be enough.
Yeah, right.
We'll see. So we have another question. Will the effort to standardize COI for journals be linked to ORCID identifiers?
I don't actually know what ORCID identifiers are.
So that they're identifiers for individual researchers to link their research and articles and so forth, I believe, yes. So I guess is the question whether they'll just kind of be a easy way to identify others' conflict of interest? Might get the revised question here in a second. Could you insert your ORCID ID and have your conflicts automatically upload to the journal? Oh, I see what you mean. So would there potentially be a way to just use an identifier, plug it into the journal form, and then just it self-automates?
That's a really great idea. Technically, that may be challenging just because we're looking at disclosures from individuals across the country at different institutions with different COI rules. And it's actually something that was looked at in the past and didn't gain a lot of traction because the COI disclosure rules that we have at MD Anderson are very different than what, say, MSK has and different than what Harvard has. And so we're all kind of moving in the same direction, but there is some variation there. So I mean, personally, ultimately, I'd love to see that. I think that makes things a whole lot cleaner. It makes it so much easier for faculty where you just have one place that you do your disclosures and then it goes out to everywhere, whether it's your home institution, publications. even, you're presenting at a conference and have to make your disclosures related to that presentation, plug it right in there. That would probably be years down the road if it even gains traction at all. But we are thinking of ways to try and make it as standardized and uniform and seamless as possible, particularly within MD Anderson, because we'd like to be able to make it so you make your disclosures into the COI database, and then you can just either pull it out yourself or ideally have some kind of automated process where it spits it into a journal disclosure form for you or spits it into a conference disclosure form for you. And that way there is the single source of truth. And so there are some technical limitations to that we honestly ought to be able to overcome. It's just a matter of working through the process and figuring out how to do it so that it makes things easier rather than adding unnecessary hurdles. But I definitely hear you. We want to move in that direction because it makes everything much cleaner and much more straightforward for everyone.
All right. I think don't see any more questions popping up, so I think we're about done here. Again, check out that handout. It has some valuable information on it. Check out the COI website through MD Anderson's Inside site, fairly easy to find. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and we will see you next webinar. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you all.